All right, so are you ready to explore how horror cinema has evolved over time?
I am.
I'm excited for this one,
Me too.
especially because you sent me so many cool sources to get ready.
Yeah.
There's like books and articles and even some behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah, we've got a lot to cover.
So we're going to trace this whole genre from its spooky beginnings, like all the way to what's scaring us today in 2024.
Should be fun.
I think it will be.
Yeah.
And to help me unpack all of this is our expert.
I.
So what I think is so fascinating about horror
Yeah,
is that it kind of acts like a mirror to like society.
it does.
You know, like the things that like scare us in movies
Yeah.
often reflect deeper anxieties about like what's happening in the world around us at that time.
Exactly.
So basically,
Yeah.
we can get a glimpse into like what's been keeping people up at night throughout history
Hmm.
just by looking at like what terrified audiences over the decades.
Yeah, and what's amazing is that horror has been around for almost as long as film itself.
Yeah.
Like literally one of the very first horror films was called Le Manoir du Diable, and that was released in 1896.
Whoa, hold on. 1896?
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing.
It's crazy.
I mean, like, film itself was barely a thing back then.
yeah, it's nuts.
So what was it like? Like, did people even find those early films frightening?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So it was only 3 minutes long.
Right.
But like this Le Manoir du Diable was full of like imagery that we now consider like classic horror tropes.
Oh, really?
Like bats and skeletons, and there was even like this Mephistopheles character.
So even back then, like, filmmakers were tapping into, like, those, like, primal fears.
They were.
Like, the things that go bump in the night.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that like these early films were drawing on like centuries of folklore and literature.
Yeah.
Like Gothic novels like Frankenstein and Dracula were hugely popular at the time, and they provided like a blueprint for many early horror films.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So they were taking, like, stories that people were already scared of and bringing them to life on screen.
Uh-huh.
So I can see how that would have been a huge deal back then.
I mean, can you imagine? That would have been nuts.
But did they actually manage to scare audiences?
I mean,
You know, like without special effects? or
and you
anything?
might be surprised at how effective they were.
Okay.
Like the silent era, particularly the German Expressionist movement, was incredibly influential in creating atmosphere and psychological dread.
Interesting.
Like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 is a perfect example.
Caligari. Yeah, I've seen like stills from that. And yeah, it's got this really unsettling,
Uh-huh.
like almost nightmarish quality to it, the
Yes,
way it looks.
Like the distorted sets and the stark lighting and the exaggerated acting.
Yeah,
It all creates a sense of unease that just like gets under your skin.
totally.
And it's not about jump scares or gore. It's about like creating a world that feels just off kilter.
Right.
Like something's not quite right.
Yeah, like something's wrong, but you don't know what. Yeah, and that's a technique that's still used in horror today.
Totally.
The power of suggestion,
Uh-huh.
the shadows lurking at the edge of the frame.
Yeah.
It's almost like what you don't see can be more terrifying than what you do.
Precisely.
Like it messes with your head more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like Caligari tapped into something primal, that fear of the unknown,
Yeah,
of the darkness just beyond our understanding.
right.
And that legacy continues to influence horror filmmaking even today.
So even without like buckets of blood and CGI monsters,
Right.
those early filmmakers knew how to get a rise out of audiences.
Oh, they did.
They just used different techniques.
They were masters of atmosphere and suggestion.
Okay. And then, of course,
Yeah.
came the era of the universal monsters,
Oh, yeah.
which brought those like literary icons to life in a whole new way.
In a big way.
Ah, yes. Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy.
Yeah.
Those are the images that like come to mind when most people think of classic horror.
For sure, and for good reason.
Why?
Those films were incredibly influential.
Okay.
They took those familiar monsters from literature and gave them faces,
Yeah.
personalities, a level of humanity
Right.
that made them both fascinating and terrifying.
I mean, Bela Lugosi as Dracula and Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster.
Oh, yeah.
Those are like iconic performances.
They are.
Their faces are practically synonymous with those characters.
I mean, it's hard to imagine anyone else in those roles now.
I know.
And it's interesting to think about, like, the level of craft that went into those performances, especially in the early days of special effects makeup.
I remember reading that Boris Karloff had to endure hours of makeup to transform into Frankenstein's monster.
4 hours in the makeup chair every single day.
Whoa.
And it wasn't just sitting there passively.
Oh, really?
He had to actively work with the makeup artist.
Interesting.
using his facial expressions and movements to help shape the character.
So it was like a real collaboration?
It was a true collaboration.
Wow, 4 hours.
It was crazy.
Talk about dedication. It's amazing to think of those actors going through all of that. Yeah. Just to bring these iconic monsters to life.
Yeah, and those films really did cement those monsters in our collective imagination.
They did. Even today, when someone says vampire or mummy, we instantly picture those classic universal monster portrayals.
We do. They set the standard.
Yeah.
But of course, the world was changing. Yeah. And with it, the things that scared us.
Right. Like we're moving into the post-World War II era now.
We are.
I can only imagine the horrors of the war.
Yeah.
Along with the dawn of the atomic age. Must have had a huge impact on horror cinema.
You're absolutely right. The fear of invasion.
Yeah.
Nuclear anxieties.
Right.
The idea of science gone wrong.
Right.
All of these anxieties fueled the horror films of the 1940s and 50s.
And what better way to embody those fears than with giant monsters?
Right.
Right.
I mean...
Creature from the Black Lagoon, Godzilla.
Yeah.
These films tapped into like a primal fear of nature unleashed, often as a result of like our own actions.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is.
In those films, the monsters are often seen as both terrifying and tragic.
Oh, really?
They're victims of scientific experimentation.
Interesting.
Of humanity's meddling with forces we don't fully understand.
So these monsters become metaphors for like the dangers of our own hubris.
They do.
Our attempts to control nature.
Exactly.
It's not just about a giant lizard smashing buildings.
Right.
It's about the consequences of our actions coming back to haunt us.
Precisely. They reflect a sense of helplessness in the face of forces we can't fully comprehend or control.
That's deep.
Whether it's the power of the atom or the depths of the ocean, these films remind us that there are things out there that are bigger and more powerful than we are.
And sometimes we're the ones who unleash them.
Sometimes we are.
Speaking of Godzilla, I read somewhere that the actor inside that suit had a pretty rough time on set.
Oh, yeah. Haru Nakajima, the first Godzilla suit actor, endured intense heat and restricted movement inside that heavy, cumbersome suit.
Oh my gosh. Imagine trying to stomp around and wreak havoc while essentially wearing a giant rubber sauna.
That's wild.
It's intense.
It's a testament to his dedication.
It is.
Not just to like the craft of acting, but to the physicality of bringing that monster to life. He literally embodied Godzilla's power and rage.
And that physicality, that rawness, is part of what made those early monster movies so compelling.
Makes sense.
But as we move into the 1960s, we see a shift away from giant monsters.
Okay.
And toward a different kind of horror.
What kind?
One that's more psychological.
Right. It's the era of Alfred Hitchcock and the psychological thriller.
It is.
And I think one film that really exemplifies this shift is Psycho.
It's a classic.
Which, even though it came out in 1960, still feels incredibly modern in its approach to horror.
It does. Psycho was revolutionary for its time.
Okay.
It moved away from like the overt monsters and gore of previous decades.
Yeah.
And focused instead on suspense, psychological manipulation.
And the horrors that lurk within the human mind.
Right. It's not external anymore. It's internal.
Exactly.
And one thing that always stands out to me about Psycho is how it uses editing and implication to create terror.
Right.
Rather than showing everything explicitly.
That's what makes it so brilliant.
It is.
Take the iconic shower scene, for example.
Okay.
Hitchcock uses quick cuts, shadows, and the sound of the knife stabbing.
Right.
But we never actually see the knife penetrate the flesh.
We don't.
Our minds fill in the gaps.
We imagine it.
And that makes it even more terrifying.
It does. It's like he understood that what we imagine can be far more disturbing than anything he can show us directly.
Yes.
And by leaving those details to our imaginations, he creates a sense of unease and dread that lingers long after the film is over.
It does, exactly. It's the power of suggestion.
Right.
The unseen terror that gets under your skin and stays with you.
Yeah, it really does.
And Psycho wasn't alone in exploring these darker, more psychological themes.
Yeah.
Like around the same time, you have Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, which brought satanic horror to the forefront.
Right. Rosemary's Baby is all about paranoia and like this slow creeping dread of the unknown.
It is.
It's less about jump scares and more about like the psychological torment of not knowing who to trust or what's real.
Right.
It just messes with your mind.
And what's fascinating is how Polanski uses the setting of the Dakota building, which he renamed the Bramford for the film, to enhance that sense of unease.
Interesting.
The building itself becomes a character.
Wow.
A looming presence that seems to hold dark secrets.
And then, of course, there's the real-life connection to the Dakota building.
Oh, yeah.
Which later became the site of John Lennon's murder.
Yeah, that's creepy.
It adds this, like, chilling layer of reality.
It does.
To the fictional horror of the film.
It's almost as if the building itself is cursed.
Yeah.
A place where fiction and reality blur in unsettling ways. It's a reminder that horror can draw from real-life anxieties and fears, twisting them into something even more terrifying.
Okay, so we've gone from shadowy figures in silent films to giant monsters stomping cities to psychological thrillers that mess with our minds.
Totally.
It's amazing how horror has reflected these changing anxieties.
It is.
Throughout history.
It is.
But I'm ready for more.
Okay.
What comes next in this evolution of horror?
Well, get ready for a wild ride because the 1970s and 80s bring us into the era of slashers.
Okay.
Where things get a lot more visceral and, let's be honest, bloody.
Oh boy, I'm ready.
I think you are. Yeah. So if the 60s were about psychological tension, the 70s and 80s were about bringing horror back to the body, to those visceral, gut-churning reactions.
It's the era of the slasher, right?
It is.
When films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween really shook up the genre.
They did.
What was it about these films that resonated so strongly with audiences?
I think they tapped into a different kind of fear.
How so?
While Hitchcock was exploring the darkness within slashers, brought horror back to the external. The tangible threat that could be lurking just around the corner.
Right, like it could happen to you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in particular had this raw, almost documentary-style aesthetic that made it feel incredibly real.
I've heard people say almost too real.
Almost too real for some viewers, for sure.
Yeah.
Shot on a shoestring budget.
Right.
With grainy footage and handheld cameras.
Yeah.
It felt like a glimpse into something you weren't supposed to see.
Like you were peeking into something you shouldn't be.
Exactly. It broke down the barrier between the audience and the screen.
Interesting.
Making you feel like you were right there in the middle of the nightmare.
Oh gosh, I hate that feeling.
It's effective, though.
Yeah, it is.
And then Halloween comes along.
Right.
And introduces us to Michael Myers.
The masked silent stalker. Who becomes like the blueprint for so many slasher villains to come?
He does.
So what was it about Michael Myers that like struck such a chord with audiences?
I think he represented something truly unknowable.
Okay.
Unlike the monsters of previous decades who often had motivations or backstories.
Right. We kind of knew why they were doing the things they were doing.
Yeah, you could kind of understand them.
Yeah.
Michael Myers was pure evil.
Yeah, he was just bad.
Just bad. He was relentless, unstoppable. And his lack of emotion made him all the more terrifying.
Oh, yeah. It's creepy when they don't have any emotion.
It is. It's like staring into an abyss.
Yeah, you said it.
There's nothing to understand, no reason to appeal to.
Nope.
He's just pure primal evil, and that's what makes him so unsettling.
And both Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre were incredibly successful.
They were.
Despite their low budgets.
It's true.
It seems like they really tapped into something that audiences were craving.
Absolutely. Halloween, in particular, became a phenomenon.
How so?
It was made for around $300,000. And it went on to gross over $70 million.
Oh, that's huge.
It just proved that you didn't need big-budget special effects to create a truly terrifying film.
I guess not.
All you needed was a simple, effective premise.
Okay.
And a character that could haunt your nightmares.
Makes sense. It's amazing to think that a film with such a low budget could have such a massive impact, both financially and culturally.
For sure.
It spawned countless sequels and imitators.
There's so many.
And it's still considered one of the most influential horror films ever made.
It is a classic.
But the slasher boom wasn't just about masked killers.
It wasn't.
It was also about the rise of practical gore effects, right?
Oh, yeah.
And one name that comes to mind is Tom Savini.
Oh, Savini.
Who's practically a legend in the special effects world.
That's a master.
What made him so special?
Tom Savini was a true innovator.
Okay.
He brought an artistry to gore effects that hadn't been seen before. In films like Dawn of the Dead and Friday the 13th, he used practical effects to create shockingly realistic and gruesome scenes.
Yeah, I can picture some of those scenes.
Pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable on screen.
It's interesting because even though CGI has come a long way,
Yeah, it has.
There's still something about those practical effects that feels more visceral.
More real.
More real.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the tangibility.
The fact that, it was actually created in front of the camera.
Right. It wasn't just made up in a computer.
Yeah, whatever it is, it adds a certain weight and authenticity to the horror.
I agree. And it's not just about the blood and guts.
No.
Savini understood anatomy. He understood how the human body worked.
He did.
And that knowledge allowed him to create effects that were both shocking and strangely beautiful in their own way.
A macabre form of artistry.
Yeah.
Where the human body becomes the canvas for these grotesque masterpieces.
That's true.
And there was so much care and detail that went into creating these effects, even if they were meant to be fleeting moments of horror on screen.
So much work for just a few seconds.
It's crazy, right?
It is. It's a testament to the dedication of those artists.
It is.
Like Savini and Rob Bottin. Who was the genius behind the effects in The Thing.
I love The Thing.
It's classic.
He was so committed to creating realistic and terrifying creatures that he practically lived on set.
Really?
Sleeping in a cot next to his workshop so he could work around the clock.
That's some serious dedication.
I know, sleeping next to your creations.
Yeah.
These grotesque, otherworldly beings.
Right.
It's almost like a twisted version of an artist's studio where the nightmares come to life.
But horror, as we've seen, is constantly evolving.
It is.
Pushing boundaries and reflecting new anxieties.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is the slasher craze starts to fade.
Well,
What fills that void?
the 90s bring a fascinating shift in the genre.
Okay.
Horror starts to become self-aware,
Would.
deconstructing its own tropes and conventions.
So it's like looking back at itself.
Almost as if it's looking back at itself with a critical eye.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Right? It's the rise of meta horror.
It is.
And when I think of meta horror, one film immediately comes to mind.
What's that? Scream.
Scream, a classic.
What was it about Scream
that
made it such a game changer?
Scream was brilliant in how it acknowledged and subverted the very cliches that had become synonymous with horror.
Right, like all those tropes we're so used to.
Exactly. The characters in Scream are aware of horror movie tropes.
Really?
They discuss them. They even use them to their advantage.
Oh, wow.
And by doing so, the film creates a whole new level of suspense and engagement with the audience.
It's like the film is in conversation with the audience,
It is.
winking at us, saying, we know you know the rules,
Yeah.
but are you ready to see them broken?
Exactly.
And it's not just about being clever.
No.
Scream still manages to be genuinely scary.
It does, even while it's deconstructing those familiar horror elements.
It's a balancing act that Wes Craven, the director, pulls off brilliantly.
Okay.
He pays homage to the films that came before, while simultaneously pushing the genre forward.
Gotcha.
And he does it with a sharp wit and a sense of humor that makes the film both entertaining and thought-provoking.
Scream was great.
It was.
And Scream wasn't the only innovation in the 90s.
It wasn't.
We also saw the emergence of found footage horror.
Oh, yeah.
With the Blair Witch Project.
Yes.
A film that tapped into a very different kind of fear.
A very different kind.
What made the Blair Witch Project so effective?
It preyed on our fear of the unknown.
Okay.
And it did it in a way that felt incredibly real by using handheld cameras and shaky footage.
Right.
The film created a sense of immediacy and authenticity that blurred the lines between fiction and reality.
I remember seeing the Blair Witch Project in theaters.
Yeah.
And it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before.
What do you remember about it?
Like the shaky camera, the whispered voices in the darkness.
Yeah.
It felt like we were watching something we weren't supposed to see.
Oh, yeah.
Something forbidden.
Totally. And that's a powerful feeling to evoke in an audience.
It is.
And the filmmakers were incredibly clever in how they used the internet to build anticipation.
Okay.
And blur the lines between fiction and reality.
How so?
They created websites and spread rumors, leading many people to believe that the footage was real.
Wow, so they really played it up.
They did, that these three filmmakers had actually vanished in the woods.
And it worked.
It did.
People were genuinely terrified.
It was a marketing campaign unlike anything we'd seen before.
Yeah.
And it perfectly captured the spirit of the film itself.
How so?
A blend of fiction and reality, of known and unknown.
And a lot of that authenticity came from the way the film was made.
It did. The actors were largely improvising.
Really?
Reacting to situations in the moment. And they were truly immersed in the environment.
Oh.
They slept in tents.
That's intense.
They filmed at night. They endured the elements. And all of that contributed to the rawness and believability of the film.
It's like they weren't just acting scared.
Right.
They were actually experiencing a level of fear and disorientation
They were.
that came through on camera.
That's what makes it so effective. It's that commitment to authenticity, both in front of and behind the camera, that made the Blair Witch Project such a landmark film.
So different than anything that had come before.
Totally. It opened up a whole new realm of possibilities for horror filmmaking, proving that you could create a truly terrifying experience without relying on big budgets or special effects.
So you don't need all the fancy stuff.
Not necessarily. All you needed was a good story.
Okay.
Compelling premise.
Right.
And a willingness to push the boundaries of what was possible.
So we've seen horror evolve from silent films to monster movies, psychological thrillers, slashers, and now meta-horror and found footage.
We've covered a lot.
We have. It's amazing how the genre has continued to adapt to reflect our changing anxieties.
It is.
And our fascination with the unknown.
Absolutely.
But what about the 21st century?
Yeah.
What's happening in modern horror?
Yeah.
What's scaring us now?
In the 2000s, we see a rise in what's often called elevated horror.
Elevated horror.
Films that aim to transcend the traditional tropes and explore deeper themes, often with a focus on psychological realism and social commentary.
Interesting.
And two directors who really exemplify this approach are Ari Aster and Jordan Peele.
Okay, we got to talk about those guys. So elevated horror.
Yeah.
It's like horror is graduating from slasher flicks.
It is.
To something
more sophisticated, of nuance.
More nuanced, yeah. When I hear that term, elevated horror, I instantly think of Ari Aster and Jordan Peele.
Oh, for sure.
Like, those are the two names that pop into my head.
Definitely, they're at the forefront of this movement.
What makes them so good at it?
Well, Aster's films like Hereditary and Midsommar, they're masterclasses in creating slow-burning dread and psychological tension.
So not a lot of jump scares.
Not so much jump scares.
Okay.
They delve into the complexities of, like, family dynamics, grief, and trauma.
Heavy stuff.
Heavy stuff, using horror as a way to explore the darkest corners of human experience.
Okay, and then Jordan Peele. With films like Get Out and Us.
Oh, yeah.
He brilliantly blends social commentary with chilling suspense.
I mean, he's not afraid to tackle big issues.
Yeah, like what?
Like race, class, and identity.
And he does it in a way that's both entertaining.
He does.
And thought-provoking.
Exactly. Peele's films are not just about jump scares or gore.
Right.
They're about using horror as a lens to examine societal anxieties and expose the undercurrents of fear and prejudice that exist beneath the surface.
Get Out, in particular, was such a groundbreaking film.
It was a phenomenon.
Yeah, it sparked important conversations about race and privilege in America.
For sure.
And it did so within the framework of a horror film.
It showed that horror could be more than just entertainment.
Right.
It could be a tool for social change.
Powerful stuff.
Really powerful. It opened up a space for filmmakers to use horror to address complex social issues.
Yeah.
To challenge audiences and to start important dialogues.
And it's not just limited to big-budget studio films.
It's not. The rise of streaming platforms has also had a huge impact on modern horror.
Yeah, I was going to say streaming services like Netflix and Shudder have given independent filmmakers a platform to reach wider audiences.
They have.
Allowing for more experimentation and diverse voices within the genre.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like we're seeing so much more creativity and risk-taking in horror these days.
I agree.
It's a good time for horror.
It is. One film that comes to mind is Host.
Yeah.
Which was shot entirely on Zoom.
During the pandemic.
It's a low-budget film.
Super low budget.
But it's so effective in how it captures the anxieties and isolation of that time period.
It's such a time capsule.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of how filmmakers can use limited resources and technology to create a truly chilling experience.
Yeah. You don't need all the bells and whistles.
You don't. And it speaks to how adaptable horror is as a genre.
It does.
It can reflect our current anxieties, our fears, and our relationship with technology in ways that other genres simply can't.
So as we look at the current state of horror in 2024, what are some of the emerging trends? What's on the horizon?
It's next.
For this ever-evolving genre?
One trend that's really gaining traction is immersive horror.
Immersive horror.
Particularly VR experiences.
VR horror.
Imagine putting on a VR headset and finding yourself in a haunted house, able to look around and interact with the environment.
Oh my God.
It takes the concept of a haunted house attraction to a whole new level.
That sounds terrifyingly immersive.
It's pretty wild.
Sign me up. But seriously,
I know, right?
it's fascinating to think about how technology is pushing the boundaries of what's possible in horror.
For sure. What else is out there?
Yeah.
Another trend that's emerging is AI-generated horror.
AI horror.
We're talking about films that use artificial intelligence to create unsettling images,
Yeah.
sounds, and even storylines.
It's like the robots are coming for us.
They are.
But in a horror movie way.
Exactly. It's a blurring of the lines between what's real and what's fabricated, which can be deeply unsettling.
Using algorithms to tap into our deepest fears.
That's right.
That's a little scary.
It's creepy, right?
It is. It's like horror is evolving alongside technology.
It is.
Finding new ways to exploit our anxieties and keep us up at night.
And that's what makes horror such a compelling and enduring genre.
It is.
It's constantly adapting, reflecting our changing fears and pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
It's never the same.
Never the same, from shadow puppets and silent films
Right.
to AI algorithms creating nightmares.
Wow, what a journey.
Horror always finds a way to get under our skin and stay with us.
So from those early flickering images of bats and devils to the immersive scares of today, horror's come a long way.
It has. But it's clear that this genre is far from finished.
I agree.
It's going to keep evolving, keep surprising us, and keep finding new ways to tap into our deepest fears.
And that's what we keep coming back for more.
It's something fascinating about confronting our fears, about exploring the darkness.
Yeah.
Even if it's just through the lens of a horror film.
Like a safe space to experience fear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a safe way to experience the thrill of fear, to test the limits of our own anxieties.
Love it.
Yeah.
And for you listening, I encourage you to keep exploring this amazing genre.
Yes, do it.
Seek out films from different eras, dive into different subgenres, and discover what scares you the most. You might be surprised at what you find.
You might be, and maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
you'll be inspired to create your own horror story.
Ooh.
After all, everyone has fears.
That's true.
And sometimes the best way to confront them is to bring them out into the open, to give them shape and form.
So until next time,
Yes.
keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those lights on.
Please do.
You never know what might be lurking in the shadows.